So there was this interchange between a mom and her son one Sunday morning. As the mom went to the son's bedroom, time to get up, get yourself ready for church. The son says from behind the door, "I don't feel like it today." Mom replies, sorry you don't feel like it, but you still need to go. Get up, let's go. The son responds, "But Mom, I'm depressed, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't even know if the people there like me anyway. I'm just going to stay in bed today." Finally, Mom puts her foot down and says, "First of all, the people there do like you. Second of all, no matter how you feel, you have to show up and do your part. And third, you're the pastor. Go to church." So my mom didn't have to wake me up this morning. I got here all by myself, and I am glad that you did as well. But we all know, right, that there are those mornings, not necessarily Sunday mornings, but other mornings where just kind of getting out of bed isn't the easiest thing to do when life has not been the simplest. Things are complicated, and the pain is raw, and then on top of that, other things that are going on in the world. Sometimes you just want to stay in bed and just kind of keep yourself covered up. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for getting here, whatever that meant this morning. Thanks for taking a step and being in a place where you can be surrounded by other people and be reminded that you're not alone. No matter where you are and no matter what you're working through, you're not alone. The people that you're sitting around here are dealing with the same issues and questions and fears and wounds and hopes. It's good that God calls us to be together and to share our stories, to ease each other's pain, to celebrate each other's joys. I'm glad you showed up. There are plenty of things that all of us have going on in our lives. As a pastor, I get invited in behind the curtain of some of your lives. And as put together or as professional as we want to at least appear, we all know, hopefully, that beneath the surface we're all struggling, we're all working through certain things, whatever it might be. Whether it's financial or it's family, whether it's illness or what's happening to a loved one, sometimes it just feels like enough. And if the challenges in your own life aren't enough, if that's not already enough, then how are we supposed to respond to the enormity of the questions and the injustices and the problems we see about and hear in our world day in and day out? Our minds simply can't contain it, and we go a bit numb. But our hearts continue to ache and swell and break. The news just keeps coming. I mean, you can just start with Yemen, right? A country that most of us didn't even know where it was or where it existed, and perhaps you don't know this morning. It is on the southern part of the Saudi Peninsula. And since a revolution that took place there a few years ago, in the response of the Saudi Arabia and some of their allies, they moved in to try to suppress the Houthi rebels. And for a few years now, there's been bombing and warfare to the point where basically the infrastructure of Yemen, the stores, the roads, the hospitals are all destroyed, to the point where the United Nations is saying today that this will be the worst humanitarian crisis we have known in our world for over 100 years. 14 million people are on the edge of starvation in the nation of Yemen. So you can just start there if your problems aren't big enough. And then, of course, we've learned recently that we've undercalculated the warming of our globe and the heating of the waters in the ocean, and what that will mean and what that already is meaning in terms of more devastating hurricanes and people in coastal areas having to migrate and move. And if it's not weather, it's warfare that has caused more people to migrate in the last 10 years than they have since World War I. Those who are migrating, who have their belongings on their back, who are forced to walk, oftentimes aren't welcomed very kindly into the nations that they find themselves forced to enter. What do you do with all that? And then, of course, as I said, sometimes we become numb to these things, but there was another mass shooting just this last weekend in Tallahassee in a yoga studio, of all places. 2 innocent people killed. And then, of course, the 13 pipe bombs that were mailed out in the mail to try to at least disrupt, distract, if not kill people who are on the other side of the political spectrum of a frustrated and angry man. And then 2 racially, religiously, hatefully motivated murder sprees, 2 black shoppers killed at a grocery store outside of Louisville because a man couldn't get into the black church that he wanted to get into with his gun. And so he shot a couple of random black people in a grocery store. And then, of course, the 11 worshipers who were murdered in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh for being Jewish and worshiping. Apparently the shooter was convinced that somehow these Jews were part of a larger conspiracy of Jews who were funding the caravan of poor Hondurans who are making their way across Central America. What do you do with that? What are we supposed to do? How do we respond to that level of fear and anger and nonsense and devastation and migration? I get invited behind the emotional facades of people as a pastor, and I want you to know that there are a lot of us who are feeling overwhelmed. If you think it's just you, you're not alone. People around you are feeling overwhelmed, and sometimes overwhelmed to the point where you feel paralyzed, like you can't do anything. You don't know what you could do, and so some people are staying home. I've gotten a couple of those phone calls in the last couple of weeks. The enormity of the challenges, the nonstop nature of the bad news and the political vitriol. You're not alone. And I'm so glad you came this morning. I'm so glad you got out of bed, but all of us continue to ask the question, what else do we do? The prophet Micah, about 2,700 years ago, was asking a similar question. A painful and loaded question, what can we do? This was a time when he knew his nation was in trouble, that his people Israel had been unfaithful to each other and to the ideals of their community and to the covenant that they had made with their God, and life was falling apart. Leadership was in flux. The nation of Israel was literally divided. Sometimes we think we're unique in being divided as a nation. Many nations are divided. Israel, which is depicted kind of in that blue box there that you can see on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, was literally divided. There's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, the Israelites and those of Judah. And there was internal conflict and warfare between the two of them. And then on top of that, the Assyrians were coming. And as the Assyrians were invading, there were people from the Crescent Triangle, the Fertile Crescent, up and down the Middle East that were being pushed ahead of the Assyrian army. And so refugees were pouring into Israel and into Jerusalem from other places, refugees that weren't necessarily appreciated or wanted, that amped up the level of anxiety and pressure and fear in Israel at that time. The poor were angry at the wealthy for hoarding provisions. People felt their land was being militarized. The wealthy on the side were paying tributes to the very Assyrians who were about to invade to try to win their favor. All the while, the government was raising tariffs on the people of Israel to pay for what was going to be a battle against the Assyrians. Things felt like they were falling apart. And so Micah, with all of this, says, God, what do we do? What are we supposed to do? What do we do with all of this? How do we respond? And that question, that angst is poured out in one of the more memorable passages from the Old Testament, Micah chapter 6, starting in verse 6. What does the Lord require? With what should I approach the Lord and bow down before God on high? Should I come before him with entirely burnt offerings, with year-old calves? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with many torrents of oil? Should I give my oldest child for my crime, for the fruit of my body, for the sin of my spirit? What can we do? The issues are great. The suffering is massive. The division is massive. The sins are massive. It requires a huge effort, a huge response. So not just one calf or one ram will do. It's going to require thousands of rams and torrents of expensive oil. NIV says 10,000 rivers of oil. There's so much that we need to repent of, so much that is required to make things right again. What can I do? Because the truth is, I don't have 1,000 rams. I don't have 1,000 goats. I might not even have one. I certainly don't have 10,000 rivers of oil. Everything that's needed, that's necessary to push back against this injustice, to drive back this darkness, I can't do it. What do I do? How do I keep people from posting white supremacist videos in social networks? How do I keep people from buying their third and fourth and fifth assault weapon? How do I keep people from aiming their hate and ignorance at folks who are innocent based on a ridiculous conspiracy theory? I can't help all of the desperate migrants that I see on TV. I can't stop global warming. I can't fix racism or sexism. What do I do when you just want to stay in bed and hope that somehow things change or the pain goes away? What do I do? And this is how Micah answers that question. In taking on the voice of God, he says this: He has told you, human one, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you, not to solve all the problems, not to do everything, not to bring justice in one fell swoop. But what does the Lord require? But just to do justice, to love kindness. The CEB translates it as embrace faithful love. I like that. What can you do to do justice, to embrace faithful love, and walk humbly with your God? That's what God asks of us. I have been, and I'm sure many of you have been, touched by and impressed with the response to the Tree of Life killings by the Jewish community. This, of course, is a religious culture that has known migration and minority status and hate crimes for millennia. I was listening to a Jewish man on the radio the other day saying that whenever, wherever you see nations drawing up their drawbridges and claiming nationalistic rights, Jews get scared. The attack on the Jewish congregation was the worst in our nation's history. Think about that. This attack on our Jewish brothers and sisters was an attack on us. They were shot by a man who had been able to find kindred voices, not just 5 or 10 or 15, but 800,000 on the social media platform that was filled with anti-Semitic rantings and ravings, saying horrible things about Janet Yellen and George Soros and these Jewish puppet masters that are moving things around our world and want to replace the white man. These 800,000 who spend time on that website justifying their feelings, stoking each other's fears. And so this gentleman went into Tree of Life Synagogue, where only the oldest and most faithful members of that congregation, people who had been there for decades, were gathered together for Shabbat service. And he killed them. Two of the younger congregants who were killed were Cecil and David Rosenthal. Just a few years apart, but both of them shared the same genetic abnormality that made them intellectually disabled. And yet they were there every Shabbat. They handed out the prayer books. They greeted people at the door. They said kind words and welcomed people with smiles. Sounds like family. And yet our Jewish brothers and sisters, after sitting Shiva and facing their sadness and their loss head on, continue to get up in pilgrimage towards healing and restoration, to carry on the commitment to welcome and to meet hatred with peace. A Jewish cantor whose children also shared the same intellectual disability as the Rosenthals wrote a poem in response. She said that even as the guns spit danger and hate in this place of worship, somehow the world was still offered a lesson of silent grace. Cecil and David Rosenthal, their anti-hate handshake of a warm hello, extended each Saturday to every friend and every stranger. There's a post on Instagram that my wife read to me that last weekend, and it shared just a simple quote, a midrash from the Talmud on Micah 6:8. Midrash is an ancient Jewish custom where rabbis and scholars interact with the text. They develop interactions and theological confirmations or conversations that fill in the gaps of the biblical stories. These Jewish people come to the Scripture not just to find the ultimate answer or the perfect belief, but to be drawn into the story, to be drawn into the questions, to push back against the pain. They understood that the Scripture was filled with question marks that invite us not just to study, but to take place in, to take part in the discerning of wisdom and the living out of reconciliation. We wrestle with it. And in staying engaged as we wrestle, hopefully, eventually, we are blessed. In the posting, the Midrash on Micah 6 said this from the Talmud: "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief." Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work. But neither are you free to abandon it. It is enormous, the challenges that we face, especially in this political year where even the people that we cheer for, that we think might be answers to our problems, seem to spend all of their television time just throwing gasoline around the hot topics and then spending millions of dollars blaming their opponent for starting the fire. Who's going to solve these things? Thank you for getting out of bed this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being the kind of people who, no matter how you feel or no matter how overwhelmed you are, still get up and take a step, who find little ways to do justice and love kindness and to walk with God as we walk with each other. Friends, we are the hope of the world. Every little action, every kind embrace, every time you respond to somebody who is frustrated or fearful with a word of peace, you are the hope. we will not let the size of the mountain keep us from continuing the climb. We are surrounded by too many good people. We're not alone. There are things that you have already done this week. I mean, think about last week, 800 people, because of Second Presbyterian Church, on the streets of Kansas City, healing and hoping and sharing and serving. That's the answer. Like Micah, like Midrash, Jesus invites us into the pain, invites us into the issues and the challenges that break our hearts and give us headaches. And Jesus reminds us, just come to the table. Just keep coming to the table. You don't have to solve it all. You will never complete the work. But there are things that you're already doing and things that you can keep doing and things that maybe you can do a little bit more of. But there's one thing we cannot do, and that is we cannot allow ourselves to abandon the work. That's our calling. I heard recently that there are two forces that primarily drive us as humans in life. Two forces that basically at a root level determine our outlook and our actions. And if a person cannot be driven by hope, if a person cannot see hope, if a person cannot access hope, then what they will see is fear. And what will drive them is fear, and what they will access is fear. Friends, hope is what we have. Hope is ours because our God comes to us. Not when everything's right and straight and clean and perfect. Our God comes to us in the dark of the night. Our God comes to us in the midst of brokenness. Our God comes to us in the frailty of human flesh and lives through the pain and the disloyalty and the racism and the sexism and the hatred and the violence and the torture. Our God lives through it all and says that love is stronger. Hope prevails. Friends, that's our superpower. That's our message. We are the hope we long to see in the world. So keep getting out of bed. And know that those days when you can't get out of bed, one of the rest of us is getting out of bed for you and working for you and praying for you. We're not in this alone. Look around. These are good people who feel the same way that you feel, whose hearts ache the same way your hearts ache, whose minds swirl with the same questions as yours. These are people that are getting out of bed every morning. And showing up at places like this to serve and to love, to care, to shake a hand, to ask if they can help. Friends, we have reason to hope. Beyond Christ, we have each other. God reminds us in this meal that God is with us always. No matter how dark or broken, with a message of hope and love and inclusion that is eternal and will not be defeated. God offers us that peace. God offers us that hope and that kindness and that justice. God walks with us and invites us to continue walking with God, weeping and healing, celebrating and touching, lifting and praying. We are invited into the grace. We're invited into the conversation. We're invited into the pain. We're invited in to bring love and hope and restoration. Know You will not solve the problems of this world. But God is. And we will. Together. In that we hope. In that we live. Amen.